Thank you being here today with us. It's a pleasure hosting you. So my name is Toby Rodrigue. I'm a PhD candidate here, researching in entrepreneurship at UQAM. And we have Neil Chaudhary, who is Assistant Director of Global Opportunities at the University of Cincinnati with us today, and Kirsten Kuiken, who is Associate Professor here at UQAM, who most of you already know, and who is the Director and Founder of le Centre d'études en entrepreneurial international et interculturel. So we decided to present to you a rich presentation of the historical perspectives of entrepreneurial activity in two regions. Okay, these regions are okay. Give me a sec here. All right. So these regions are the American Midwest and Quebec. Right. So these are two important geographic regions of North America. And so we'll start going over these regions, and we'll scope into two smaller urban regions of these two regions, the city of Cincinnati in Ohio and the city of Montreal here in Quebec. There's two main reasons why we chose to go over these two cities. One, I would start with a question to you. If you just look at the images here, two cities, Montreal, Cincinnati, is there something that stands out that is a commonality of these two urban areas that have evolved over time? Anything that stands out? Skyscrapers? Well, it does stand out, but that's something that a lot of big cities would have. Anything else?
Rivers.
Yeah, water, the rivers, exactly. So Cincinnati is on the Ohio River and Montreal on the St-Laurent. And it's important because these two water passages were key in the economic and social development of these two cities. And we'll go over that, in the presentation. But these two cities were really like important hubs between, in one case, the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. So that's how Montreal really evolved over time, being that key area. And then Cincinnati, obviously, was really a hub, not just between the eastern and the western United States, but also the northern and southern United States. So a very central location for the country of the United States. So we'll go into that. But the second reason also we went with these two cities, that you would not see here, but it's been 20 years that there's an active collaboration between the University of Québec à Montréal, at UQAM here in Montreal, and the University of Cincinnati, key university in the city of Cincinnati. And through this collaboration that we'll present towards the end, there's been a lot of different courses and programs that have evolved over time and keep evolving, obviously. So here's what we offer as a plan of presentation, starting with an introduction, talking about what do we mean by culture, what do we mean by entrepreneurship, setting down the table to go afterwards, looking in the entrepreneurial culture of the United States and of Quebec, and then scoping in on the Midwest of the United States with the city of Cincinnati, and then Montreal and its entrepreneurial ecosystem. And finishing, as I mentioned, with the collaboration that's been going on between our two universities. So without further ado, I will let Kirsten take over here.
So I'm Kirsten Kuiken, as Toby already introduced, professor here at the Department of Management, and more to say in entrepreneurship and innovation. So I'm going to set the stage for what's coming after, to define a few terms, just to be sure that we all know what we're going to talk about during the next hour and a half. So the first aspect is, what do we mean by saying entrepreneurial culture? Maybe you're not all familiar with this term, maybe you're not from the field of entrepreneurship, or you are, or you're not quite sure. So here's one definition that we propose. It is a pretty long one, but I'll still read it to you. So it's an attitude or an aptitude through which social territories or society recognize and stimulate personal values and management abilities among its entrepreneurs, and thus allows them to take advantage of their initiative spirit, their unique sense of risk-taking, as well as their ability to innovate and efficiently manage their relationships with the environment. So shortly, there's a reflection going on in societies. What kind of entrepreneurial setting, what kind of entrepreneurial culture we want to create, we want to foster in our country, or as in Quebec, in our society, in order to foster entrepreneurship and to help entrepreneurs also build their business. So, and then the second aspect that is important to mention is that the economic model of a country is also influencing the way that entrepreneurial culture is created. And we will get to that when we speak about the US context and the Quebec context in particular a little bit later, which means that its governance, its financial structure of the country, the social system of the country, will actually also have an impact on entrepreneurial culture. So the culture also, of course, its values, beliefs, has a strong influence on the entrepreneurial orientation and the way, and that's the last point on that slide, the way actually entrepreneurs think and act. So it's influencing the way entrepreneurs create their business, will actually walk through the process of entrepreneurship, and maybe also master or not failure or risks, etc. And to think about culture when it comes to entrepreneurship is actually one of the oldest questions of entrepreneurship. It's been a long time that people reflect on culture and its impact on entrepreneurship. However, academically speaking, it's still not fully explored. So in 2022, where we have already, at least in Quebec, more than 60 years talking about entrepreneurial culture, well, we still have not clearly defined what this entrepreneurial culture actually is, academically speaking. So we would like to do with this presentation also an effort to contribute to getting to know the entrepreneurial culture of Quebec and also, of course, in the Midwestern area of the US. So the other term we might need to define is the term entrepreneur, because it's part of entrepreneurial culture. So here, two things to say. The first thing is that we moved progressively from a managerial economy to an entrepreneurial economy. What does that mean? It means that before there was a large attraction of large corporations, such as IBM, such as Bombardier, such as Siemens in Germany, etc. And the aspiration was often to work for such large corporations. So there was also, academically speaking, a lot of work on intercultural, cross-cultural management in larger organizations, which still is happening, of course. However, there was a shift to what the OCDE, so an international research organization, is calling the entrepreneurial economy, where we see that there's a tendency to found one's own business, to become an entrepreneur, and we see a tendency to more and more small and medium-sized enterprise and to a startup culture that is rising in most Western, but also, of course, other Asian or other economies. So we are moving towards, or we are already in an entrepreneurial economy, which then leads us to the importance of studying culture and understanding how does culture also impact these small businesses and the experience of founding a startup or another form of organization. And the second thing I would like to mention when we speak about entrepreneurs is the fact that, of course, the idea here that we have is to put ourselves in an entrepreneurial posture. So anybody can be an entrepreneur. We don't have to be a certain gender or a certain age or a certain kind of person. We can be a social entrepreneur, we can be a senior entrepreneur. So the idea is anybody can be an entrepreneur, and we're looking here at the posture and the daily activities of entrepreneurship, which is what for us defines the entrepreneur. So far, so good. Now, the missing element that we still have not fully explored here is culture. So what is culture? And the way we would like to talk about culture here is how it is actually discussed in organization studies. So I do not want to go too much into detail, but just to let you know that we have three main approaches of culture in organization studies, which some of you know very well, some of you maybe are discovering right now. So just very briefly, there's a first approach that is often based on a culture comparison. We also call it sometimes behaviorist approach, and where it's mainly comparing values internationally. And there's been a huge study in the 80s done by Gerhard Hofstede, which is one of the authors that is often quoted for this approach. And the idea was to compare value scales internationally, so it's mostly quantitative work, which is one approach of understanding culture. The second one here is the interpretative research. So here, the idea of understanding culture is more of a grounded and anthropological approach. So really understanding culture from the roots, culture as a phenomenon, diving deep into context, etc. And you have a few authors that actually exploring this approach, very known in the Francophone environment and also in Quebec, very known approach in organization studies. So, and here the work is rather qualitative, so different methodology. And we have the critical intercultural management, which is, of course, like the term it already says, a critical approach to culture, mostly criticizing that cross-cultural management is often seen from a Western perspective, that it can sometimes lead to power relations that are maybe a little bit different, and questioning how and why cultural approaches have been developed. So that's a third perspective that is not too present yet in entrepreneurship, but in organization studies also very interesting. So that being said, what we would like to do is to mostly adopt an interpretative view. So what we would like to do is not comparing the Midwestern context and the Quebec context based on value scales or based on quantitative research, but we want to sort of take out our glasses and look close at those regions and try to understand what are the historical roots of these entrepreneurial cultures and what is the environment that actually forged this entrepreneurial culture. And even though those in entrepreneurship we don't necessarily adopt this approach, there is something called a contextual perspective, which is what we're trying to do here. So this we see there's a strong link between this interpretative research and that contextual perspective, basically saying we're looking at the context in which takes place entrepreneurship. So we're looking at in Quebec or in the Midwest of the US, well, how can we define this context, and how does this context then influence how and why entrepreneurs actually act? So that's for the introduction. We kept it light in terms of the references, so I hope everybody's following. So now let's dive into the US context. So first thing that comes to mind, I don't know you, but first thing that comes to mind very often is the fact that when we look at the US context, that is a very prosperous context for entrepreneurship, that you have a long-standing entrepreneurial culture, that people are risk takers, and that actually entrepreneurship sort of emerged from the American dream that is like you can become rich by creating your project. So there's a lot of attraction and interest for the US context to actually see how entrepreneurship was developed in this context and how can we get inspired also elsewhere. Of course, there's a lot of critiques. We're going to get to that a little bit later, but that's maybe the first image that we get. Maybe you have a different one, but that's what we see the most. And then, well, you have that quote on the left where also we have academic literature that comes to that same conclusion, saying, well, there's cultural and social norms existing that actually support entrepreneurship and help new businesses grounding, because it's well seen to be an entrepreneur in the US. Maybe compared to other countries, it stands out as a very supportive culture, and also a very supportive culture for risk and for failure. So compared, for example, to the European world, Europeans often say, well, here we are not risk takers. If we fail once, maybe we cannot fail twice because we don't get a second chance. So that also is a big aspect of the US. So of course, this is all general statements. So now let's look a little bit deeper into that context. So when it comes to industries, I have here some statistics about the entrepreneurial activity in the last year, just to give you a little bit of a breakdown per industry. And here, what is striking, maybe it's a little small for the numbers for you in the back. However, I can explain that. So basically what we see is there's a lot of growth in terms of when it comes to the information and communication sector or for service industries. You might not be surprised because we mostly live in service economies nowadays, so value is created not by physical workforce, but mostly by brain power. And the US has been very much putting a lot of attention to technological projects. So this, when it comes to entrepreneurial culture, we often say also startup culture, because there is a lot of startup ecosystems that actually play a big role. And of course, there's also the manufacturing logistics aspect and the classical agricultural factor, and Neil will speak a little bit about that later. So of course that's not to be forgotten. Those sectors still exist and actually are part also of the history of the US entrepreneurial culture. For example, Detroit as being a leader in the automotive industry for a long time before actually transforming to something else, but I don't want to get to that part just yet. And so basically saying, yes, there's a lot of focus on startups, and the startup culture seems to be very inspiring for other countries, which is why we're going to look a little bit further into startup culture just in a bit. So when I say contextual and grounded approach, I just want to give you another example of what kind of approach we actually take. So I give you an example of another study that has been done on the US already 20 years ago, but that looked at what are metaphors that entrepreneurs actually use in the US to describe what they do. So, and they came up with what they call a grounded cultural model of US entrepreneurship. So it's not to compare it to another country. Again, it's really looking at the phenomenon and looking at the context, but it's looking at metaphors and at history in order to understand the particularity of the US context. And here, I don't want to go too much into detail, but just give you a couple of examples. One key term that always sort of came back is the term of journey. Entrepreneurship as a journey, as a personal experience. And when I told that to Neil, Neil was saying, yes, that's definitely a journey. So that's sort of the keyword that marked entrepreneurial experiences in the data that was used for the study. And also the aspect of building something. So I don't know if this works. Yes, here, building something in the middle. So building a business, building something, creating a project during the journey. Then you have also parenting, so sort of nurturing the business. That's also another factor. You have race in terms of, not race in terms of color or human race, but in terms of speed. So competition and being the best and running out of time. So time is money. We kind of know that from the US context as well. So that comes up again also in the entrepreneurial context. Passion also very strong. And actually the writings on passion, on entrepreneurship came from the US and influence until today the entrepreneurial literature. And war. So war in terms of competition internationally, because we know that the US is a liberal economy and that there's always been that question, the survival of the fittest, the competition aspect, and we want to be inspired and better than other economies. So that also comes back when we talk about entrepreneurship. And at the end, all the way to the bottom, we have the iconoclasm, so creative destruction. Some of you might know this as an economy concept. So basically, it's the idea to permanently create something new and maybe destructing at the same time something old that is obsolete now. So just to give you an idea of how we can try to understand the particularity of culture based on interpretation and metaphors here in this case. Okay? So going to the startup culture. So now we're going to look at this particular startup ecosystems that are so fascinating worldwide. And of course, I cannot speak about startups without speaking about the Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley is the home, as many of you know, or all of you know probably, the home of companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, etc. So the famous GAFAM that we always see in the media. So San Francisco Bay Area with, startups also like Dropbox and Uber emerging over there and actually becoming eventual multinationals. So the question has been raised for a long time, since the 90s already, why is the Silicon Valley so successful? What makes it a very successful innovation ecosystem? And one of the explanations, of course, there's always several sides to the story, but one of the explanations that I would like to provide is this venture capital. Okay, what is venture capital? Venture capital is basically a form of financing high-risk businesses, put very simply, which was actually invented in the US by a French, yes, Georges Doriot, who came to the States for professional reasons, and who actually found the United States as being a great context for inventing venture capital. Why? Well, we might get to the risk concept again. So the awareness of risk, the idea to really want to take that chance, take that leap, try to make something big happen, but having a lot of risks on the way. So actually, Georges Doriot, he understood that the classical banking system would no longer work if we wanted to create high-risk business and startups. So he went around and found some partners to actually set up this particular form of funding, which we call today venture capital, and which nowadays then fund sometimes a couple of $100s, but most likely a couple of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, depending on the company, and inject them into highly promising businesses, such as Google, Airbnb, Dropbox, etc. They all have been funded by this kind of investment because banks would not necessarily agree and would actually ask for a refund eventually, so this is not the right form of financing. So that is one explanation as to why the Silicon Valley was actually able to lift those businesses and bring them to a global player. And of course, also the collaboration between actors in the US and in that Silicon Valley area is one of the other factors that explains. So there we have really like this high-tech cluster, which sort of became a metaphor for the US entrepreneurial culture. But is it the only one? We're going to answer that question. I think you already know the answer to that question. So definitely there's something else. But let's stick with the venture capital for a bit, just to have some bit of a comparison. So if we look at the global markets for venture funding, so here you see statistics on how much money is actually injected into startups like Google or Airbnb. Well, Google now is no longer a startup, but anyways, at the beginning. And you see, like in comparison to China, who's actually pretty strong when it comes to investing in total, well, the US is still a leader in that. And this is basically also why we have this large attraction of more capital coming in. So it's sort of the chicken and the egg question. Well, it's a very attractive market for high-tech businesses. However, I have to also add that, of course, the US is a large economy. So we have other smaller economies, which I might need to read for those of you in the back. So if you look at the investment per capita, meaning like really breaking it down to the population, well, you have countries like Singapore or Israel or Estonia who actually jumped on that VC model, built their own VC model, and are actually now, when we look at the financing per company, are actually stronger when it comes to VC funding. So, of course, the US was an inspiration because the model came from the US. However, it was adapted to other contexts, so that's not to be forgotten. All right. So coming back to that critical part, right? Because you already maybe have suspected that it's not the only entrepreneurial culture here. So when we look at the US, it's not all Silicon Valley. And actually, there's a lot of talks about that companies are leaving the Silicon Valley for various reasons. So there's critical voices rising about, is this ecosystem really that strong, that powerful? Is this the future? Is this the aspiration we should have? And that's a real question that everybody should ask oneself. Because what are the facts? The facts are that companies like Uber nowadays are still not profitable. You might be surprised, but it's true. And that also there's a huge amount of company startups that are launched that are based on too high of a risk assessment and that fail after 2-3 years, and that there's a lot of capital actually lost when injected in the first place. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, the rising living costs in the Silicon Valley, which makes it impossible for certain people to find housing or even to work if you're not working as a top engineer for one of the startups in that area. And also talks about that collaboration culture that is finally maybe not so great after all, after examining it a little bit more closer, because there's also a lot of competition and it's not that easy as it looks. Okay, so there's other cities that are rising in the US that are known as interesting startup hubs, as having an interesting entrepreneurial culture, and the Midwestern region is one of them, which is why Neil, in a bit later, after talking about Quebec, is going to go in detail about that. Maybe one alternative that could be interesting to explore. So I'll leave that for a bit later as a surprise. And we are going to speak about Quebec. So again, we want to adopt an interpretative perspective and looking at the context in which entrepreneurial culture emerged. So there might be a couple of elements for Quebecers who are very well known, so I don't need to go too much into detail, or maybe a few surprises as well. So with my students, sometimes we discovered that there's a lot of surprises as well. If we go back in the 60s, well, what actually happened and who is this guy? So let's look at it. Okay, so we have 3 phases of entrepreneurial culture. First, the entrepreneurial state, starting in the 60s. Again, after that, the partner state, starting in the 80s, and entrepreneurship in the age of globalization and the knowledge economy. So let's go back a little bit in time and look at what happened in the 60s. So 62 years ago. 62 years ago, what happened? There was 2 worlds of entrepreneurship. And you're going to tell me after this conference if you still find there's 2 worlds of entrepreneurship. I'll leave that up to you. There's the Anglophone entrepreneurship, which was mainly, and here we're really looking at the 60s, big industries. So big corporations, heavy investments, like really we're looking at industrial organizations, metals, petrol refining, etc., which were pretty much led by the Anglophone section of Montreal. Because as you know, Montreal is a bilingual city, and also in Quebec, there's parts of companies that were actually settling down and that were Anglophone at the time. And there still are. And we have the Francophone entrepreneurship, which was mostly based on SMEs, so small and medium enterprises, and mostly also very locally grounded. So forest exploitation, food production, construction, food industry, also media was in the hands of the Francophones and still is, and retail businesses as well. And then you started seeing also that there was important industries such as the financial industry and insurance that got in the hands of Francophones, and also then diffusion tools, as I mentioned before, media became very much got in the hands of Francophone entrepreneurs, and they all had their business associations that were Francophone, and they were in coexistence with the Anglophone business associations. So imagine this, you have a Quebec where you have separate business associations in English, and you have separate business associations in French, and it's up to you as an entrepreneur to position yourself and to decide, well, which kind of network you want to belong to, because there was not necessarily much of a parallel world at the time. So again, we'll get to the current context a bit later. And then you saw something that that's called the quiet revolution. I was going to say révolution tranquille, so in French, the révolution tranquille. So what does that mean? It meant that there was political entrepreneurship, meaning the state stepped in and said, well, wait a second, let's take an active role and have a word to say about health, education, and energy, and bring those Francophone businesses up to life, make it bigger, make them more visible internationally. And then you had a number of state-owned organizations that were built at this time that were actually called crown corporations, les organisations de la couronne in French, and they were of important scale. So, for example, Hydro-Québec. Up until today, electricity is national here in Quebec, so yeah, that's a whole different story, but it started in the 60s. We have the Caisse de dépôt et déplacement, which exists still today, which is a huge and important institution for investment in Francophone businesses, and it's still a minor actionnaire, so a minor stakeholder of most important Quebec businesses. As an institution, sorry. Then you had the Société Générale de Financement, I don't know how to translate that, but anyways, General Society of Financing, I guess, and important actor also for leverage, financial leverage for organizations. And then you start something happening really on the religious level and the society level that had nothing to do, well, first of all, nothing to do with entrepreneurship, but that was something called the cultural affirmation, the social distancing from the Catholic Church. So, as many of you know, Quebec was very dependent on the church until the 60s. There was, schools were under the rule of the Catholic Church, so very present in the Quebec society, which then means also that, of course, business was also influenced by Catholic values, etc. So when it comes to culture, that's a big aspect. And then we saw progressively that in the 60s, things were moving. Women became stronger, so we have, in this Révolution tranquille, we have a lot of female independence, but we also have a religious independence, so we have a laicization of the state, where actually all religions are tolerated, or even more, to say, religion does not necessarily have a place in business discourse or in education discourse. So that's a history lesson in 2 minutes. But you know, if you're interested, of course, we can talk a little bit more about this in the question period. So and then you had a phenomenon that was born during this time, which is called the Québec Inc. So maybe the younger generation doesn't know what Québec Inc. is anymore. I don't know if I'm belonging to the younger or the older generation, that doesn't matter. However, the Québec Inc. was something that I was really interested in when I came myself to Quebec. I came from Germany a couple of years ago. And the idea, there's 2 main principles underlying the Québec Inc. phenomena. The first one is the Francisation of the business sphere, to say, hey, we Francophones, we can also do serious business. Let's stop being afraid or hesitant because of the presence of the Anglophones. Let's do our own thing. That was one. And then, of course, related to that, the improvement of the economic performance internationally. Of course, then after it became a very political project, but let's stay here at entrepreneurship because we just want to have 1 hour and a half, right? So that's the growth and the birth moment of that Québec Inc. And actually, I don't know if you know this guy, this is Jacques Parizeau, okay? He was a counselor for the government in the 60s, became later the Ministry of Finance, but that's another story. And actually, he was mandated when he was about 30 years old, so pretty young, let's say, to do a study on the nationalization of electricity in Quebec. So he did that. He was super passionate about it and handed in that study to the ex-president of Quebec, which was Jean Lesage from the Liberal government. And he said, great idea. I like that. So let's go to New York and negotiate that. So he went, and they both went. He was in his early 30s, Jacques Parizeau, and they negotiated a deal of $350 million at this time, and nowadays it can be compared to $2.7 billion when we compare with inflation, So meaning that this was the moment when electricity was actually nationalized in Quebec, and it still is. And that was the beginning of the nationalization of several industries, such as forestry. There was a lot of things going on, then other energy industries, and then we also had a financial movement that was looking into being more Quebec-oriented and nationalized. All right, so the state had an active role to play during that time, and it still had an active role to play in the 80s. So here now we are at the second phase of this entrepreneurial culture evolution, which we call the partner state. Okay, so the state became a partner for entrepreneurs and put into place, and this was still Jacques Parizeau, by the way, put into place several economic innovations that helped Francophone Quebec companies to actually emerge and to grow. So the first innovation is called a régime d'épargne et d'action. So what does that mean? There was actually a tax deduction that was given if there was investments of a certain amount into Quebec companies. So to really start to foster the Quebec businesses. And then you had organizations such as Bombardier, the Power Corporation, which is at the time was insurance and other sectors, but now is mostly media oriented. SNC-Lavalin, engineering company, Saputo, and cheese and alimentary company, etc., who actually, yes, were based on this nationalizing idea, on the Quebec Inc. idea, but then became global corporations because they had the leverage to actually go international, and they're until now, well, several of them are still on the world map for their respective industries. So Bombardier, for example, just a little story, started with the skidoo, like the little snowmobile that they invented. has been. So now what do they do? Well, they are the leader in Quebec's aerospace industry, and they collect around them around 400 other companies that build the Quebec entrepreneurial culture for aerospace. So this is the roots of those success stories that actually have been set already in the 80s. And then there was a lot of complicity between governmental agencies, ministries, business managers, and Quebec Inc. was growing rapidly. So it was sort of a social project, and hence very important when we look at the emergence of entrepreneurial culture here in Quebec. Last phase, and I'm going to go a little quick on that, is the fact that we are now in the knowledge economy. So world borders opened up. We have, of course, this international linkages that are very present and that we got very aware of during COVID time, because we also knew that we were depending on each other very much. So what does that mean for Quebec? Well, for Quebec, that also meant that the development of the regions was encouraged, so meaning also more northern and more rural areas were developing. That means also that entrepreneurship at school was more valorized. So it's now we have a program of entrepreneurship at UQAM, but it's not that old. So it's been developed in the 2000s and later. We have valuation of the entrepreneurship in the media, which is actually a huge contribution also to young people aspiring to become entrepreneurs nowadays. So also, of course, the power corp behind that played a big role. But just to say, we have a lot of encouragement by the media also to show success stories of entrepreneurs here in Quebec. And then we have the importance of social entrepreneurship and the social economy, which brandmarks really the Quebec culture and that we see until today. Is very present and very growing. And actually at UQAM, we have a great area of expertise of my colleagues of mine who are working on social entrepreneurship and social economy as well. A diversification of sectors. So we of course became also more of a service economy with biotech, fashion, video games, etc. And the diversification, very important, of entrepreneurial profiles, so women, immigrant, First Nation, etc. So we have also this diverse profiles that really are important to mention. All right, just a wrap up here. So couple of highlights from what we just discussed. So we have, of course, if you look at today's tendencies, we have more and more women in entrepreneurship. We have a lot of Aboriginal entrepreneurship projects that are often also social entrepreneurship projects. We have so this empowerment and this collaboration also between entrepreneurs that became very important. Here you have the heart and a bill, so social economy, to bring together sort of the community and also the prosperity of the business. And we have also something which is more Canada-wide, but still important in Quebec. We see Canada more and more as being the next entrepreneurial tech community. So I'll get to that a little bit later when we speak about Montreal. So a lot of observers say that Canada has really potential to be as inspiring as the US, or in a different way at least. And this is also being reflected by the level of innovativeness that is measured internationally. So Canada is at first place here. That's numbers from last year in terms of new projects that are launched and in terms of like eagerness for innovation. So of course, I've been talking about Quebec most of the time. And here I'm talking about Canada because sometimes all numbers are not available for Quebec. But just the little parenthesis, why actually do we care about talking about Quebec and not about Canada? Well, two responses to that question. You might have figured this one out already. Language, which also, of course, then led to a different entrepreneurial culture. So the idea that we have two languages and more now leads to very dynamic ecosystems and to a different dynamic than the rest of the country. The second answer is that history that I just described, and also the fact that institutions and the environment have been very adapted to this culture and actually frame now political guidelines for entrepreneurial culture. So that was a quick overview on both entrepreneurial cultures. Of course, I do not claim to have portrayed everything here, but just to give you a nice insight. And yeah, well, there's some numbers, but I think I'm going to hand over to Toby now for a transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm very quickly going to provide a transition just before we look into the Midwestern region of the United States. I would like to ask if you have any questions, maybe towards Kirsten and what she has presented, just before we transition and give you a chance maybe to share anything at this point, if there is anything. If not, yes, we do have one.
Maybe if I may, because when I listen to the term of culture, I'm thinking of values, practices, problem solving, and what was described for me was context. And I'm wondering what is specific, or is there something specific in practices, or I mean, you talked about Bombardier, and we had for the American approach risk-taking, for example. So what would be the equivalent for Quebec entrepreneurial culture? Is also risk-taking, or I mean, you described the institutions, the state, the history, but what is the culture? What is the specificities?
Yeah, I said it indirectly, and thank you for the question. It's when we look at the Quebec Inc. context, for example, this whole aspect. So when it comes to, okay, sorry. I thought it was on already. When it comes to practices, there's still this, what some people call French connection, in a way. So this idea of reaching out and bonding together and sort of to make projects happen. So that is, if we look at in terms of values, it's more of a collective action that, yes, finally leads to individual projects, but it still has this collective ground, and this, in French we often say solidarité, so this solidarity between entrepreneurs and to sort of interconnect. So that we can see very strong, especially in the Francophone environment. Which also has his drawbacks, but that's one thing that comes to mind. And the other thing that comes to mind is also the strong need to coordinate and to reach out to public actors as well. So not necessarily this advancing freely and independently in one direction, but sometimes this looking back and seeing, well, am I doing things the way that the state is expecting me to do it? This coordination within sectors as well, that sometimes, of course, is a big advantage, but sometimes can also slow down a little bit the entrepreneurial activity. So I don't want to go too much into the individual characteristics, but that's two aspects that stick out, and I will get back to that when we speak about Montreal a little bit later also. But thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Yes, one more.
That's a big question. Yeah, very, very quick answer, but we can maybe in the discussion period get back to that because it's an interesting one. So the VC environment, the venture capital environment, is very specific and actually has very strict criteria also on what is funded and what is not. And sometimes it's even not accessible to organizations that are not classified as startups per se. So there's a lot of debate on that. And actually in Quebec, there's sort of a jealousy and a frustration sometimes to the US market and say we want to be like Silicon Valley. Why are we not like Silicon Valley? Which, of course, well, I'm not necessarily daring to. However, so the problem that we have is that there's a lot of Quebec companies that go abroad to actually get funded by US VC funds, and then they're not Quebecer companies anymore. So to set up such collaboration through VC seems to me extremely hard to push through, so there might be other avenues that are a little bit more accessible. So, yeah, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we'll continue, and I'll invite Neil to bring us on a journey and explore the American Midwest.
Here you go. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having this in English. My apologies. I know Americans have a very well-deserved reputation for being terrible with languages. I do speak another language, it's just not French, okay? If we want to do this in Korean, yeah, okay, cool. We can do that. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the American Midwest and then Cincinnati a little bit in general. So when we say the American Midwest, we have different terminology for it. Midwestern, Midwest, the American Midwest, whatever. I'm just going to say the Midwest. And so the states that we're talking about here, I'm going to move around a little bit. States that we're talking about here are states here, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana. They're flat, okay? These are our traditional Midwestern states. They're flat states. Let's get an idea of what we are talking about here. Midwest is a bit of a misnomer. This was the original West for the United States. When most people think of the American West, we go back and we think of like the Old West with gunfighters and the OK Corral and all that stuff. No, the original West was Illinois. It was Indiana. It was these places. And we wanted to get people here. Now, I think it's most amazing when we talk about these places is that what we're talking about are the states where we tried to get immigration to come out of the Northeast and into the Midwest. And we did this through several things. History is important here, as we'll talk about, because it plays a role in the culture that we get the entrepreneurial ecosystems in the Midwest. The United States would do lots of what we called homestead acts. And essentially, the government would tell people, hey, move to these areas and we will give you X dollars, some mules to go along with it, and you can set up your farms. They started doing this in 1862, and they did several of them. But they did it with purpose. One, the biggest reason, they did not want anyone from the South going to the Midwest. Why? The South had a slave labor-based economy. They did not want to expand that to the Midwest, so the homestead rules were fairly simple. It was open to immigrants, it was open to women, and you could not have taken up arms against the federal government. That cleared out a lot of the Confederates. So if it's open to immigrants and it's open to women, so you have a lot of the population in the Northeast at that time, a lot of established Northeasterners, they're like, why do I want to leave New York or Boston or Philadelphia or what have you to go to the Midwest, these places that are flat, cold winters, hot summers, and I'm going to start all over again? No, thank you. So then who went? Immigrants. Lots of Germans, lots of Swedes, lots of Norwegians, okay? And this plays a role in the culture of the Midwest that we have today, and it is still a heavy influence. So what are the cities that we're talking about here? So we have some of them here. Most of these should be fairly familiar cities. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, places like that. Now, a lot of these cities, people would like to say they've done a 180. A 180 does not describe these cities. A 360 describes these cities. These are the original flyover states, the original flyover cities. In the last 40 years, these were not considered generally places where people wanted to live. Think about terminology that we use for a lot of these places. Who's heard of the mistake on the lake? It's the nickname we have for Cleveland and has stuck for years. Think about the example of the Rust Belt. When we talk about the Rust Belt, everyone, even if you're not American, knows, oh, you're talking about that area right there. But it's not really the terminology that we're using today, and we're definitely making an effort to move away from this terminology. Now, there are big cities that are not included on this list. Kansas City is a massive Midwestern city. St. Louis is a massive Midwestern city. Milwaukee is not on this list. Madison, Wisconsin is not on this list. So there's lots of other cities that we have not included here. So let's look at the entrepreneurial context of the Midwest in general then. Oh, my apologies. So we're going to start looking at some of the cities. So let's start with the big one, Chicago, the Windy City. So Chicago, everyone knows all about Chicago. For years, it was called America's third city, although these days, I think Houston is fighting for that nickname, although much to the chagrin of Chicago. And so Chicago is the nation's #1 eco-startup system. They played a major role in American economic, cultural, and political history. It's a hub in America for culture, sports, higher ed, commercial business. And it has a reputation for being a friendly startup ecosystem for women and minority-owned startups. Can anyone think of perhaps the most famous female entrepreneur from Chicago? At one point, she was the wealthiest woman in the world. Oh, okay. Any idea? Oprah. Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey is definitely an entrepreneur. Oprah Winfrey was a journalist. She was a newscaster in Nashville, Tennessee. And she moved to Chicago and started her own media company, Harpo, and the rest is history. It's interesting to know, I'm a history guy, the Midwest has had a lot of important women entrepreneurs throughout its history, particularly women of color. At one point, the wealthiest black women in America all got started in the Midwest. Madam Walker, who started her stuff with cosmetology, especially, started that in St. Louis, and then other African-American women also with cosmetology and hair products would get started in Kansas City. Remember the Homestead Act? The Homestead Act was purposely pulling in immigrants and women. Other places we have, and then since 2019, over 32% of all the venture capital deals in Chicago have invested in women. Indianapolis, just a very, very short drive, hour and a half, 2 hours north of Cincinnati. It is an emerging hub that is definitely on the move. It's noted for steadily becoming a center for new technology, especially B2B software. Salesforce, if you've ever had to deal with Salesforce, that is based out of Indianapolis. I think Indianapolis, you'll see this a lot with a lot of these universities, but Indianapolis is a great example. These Midwestern cities, one of the strongest things they have going for them, besides low cost of living, is access to large land-grant public universities. The American university system is based on, the public system is based on these large land-grant universities. Ohio State, Indiana, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan. If you haven't been to one of these campuses or seen them, massive, massive universities, enormous populations with enormous resources. Indianapolis is a perfect example. You might think Indianapolis, and you might think, why tech hub in Indianapolis? Because within the state of Indiana, which is not a very large state, you have Indiana University, Notre Dame, and Purdue. 3 of the best universities that you will get in the United States, and they are just a pipeline that goes to Indianapolis. Yes, you have plenty of graduates from those universities that will want to go to Silicon Valley, or will want to go to New York, or will want to go to Seattle, or even Chicago. But you also have lots who will say, no, the cost of living in those places is outrageous. Why go to those places where I might make a 6-figure salary, but I still have to have a roommate? When I can make a 6-figure salary and buy a very nice home at age 25 in Indianapolis. I think ag tech is going to be the future for Indianapolis. It is an agricultural state, and it is prime region for ag tech. Columbus is the capital of Ohio. It's where Ohio State University is. Believe it or not, when most people think of Ohio, people that know some stuff about Ohio, they think Cincinnati or Cleveland are usually the largest cities in Ohio. It's not. It is actually Columbus, and by far and away, it is the largest city. And in the earlier days, it was home to a lot of major manufacturing, which obviously decreased when the overall manufacturing sector in the United States collapsed. But they have completely come back and now have a very strong and diverse economy based on healthcare, education, insurance, banking, and several other things, making it the 4th highest growth entrepreneurship activity. Again, Columbus is anchored by Ohio State, those large land-grant universities that are tied to the cities and the states. You will continuously see this feature. Pittsburgh. Now, I'm from Cincinnati, and I have to be honest, people in Cincinnati have a real rivalry with people in Pittsburgh. Our sports teams don't like each other, our citizens don't like each other, and everything like that. The reason is, I think, because we're almost the same. Okay, we are very, very, very similar cities. We are both cities on the water. We are both cities that had, same water actually, the Ohio River. We are both cities with strong universities in our cities. In the case of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon is one of the greatest engineering schools in the world. And then we had our manufacturing sectors, and they just completely collapsed. Pittsburgh is probably one of the best known examples of what we would call the Rust Belt. Okay, Mark Twain. Mark Twain visited Pittsburgh one time in the 1880s, and he described the city as hell with the lid taken off. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Lots of coal, lots of industry, lots of steel, lots of smog, smut, all of this stuff in the air. It was a very heavily industrialized city, and it then just collapsed. Okay? So how do we bring these back? Again, we are tied to the local universities to reinvest in things like life sciences, manufacturing, robotics, AI, etc. I also find Pittsburgh unique because while we're talking about a lot of Midwestern cities, Pittsburgh is on that border kind of a little bit. It is Midwestern, but it's also considered very Appalachian also as well. So you have a little bit different culture there of that Scotch-Irish culture coming in along with the German and the Scandinavian influences that you might have. Detroit, Motor City. Detroit is very famous for where it was, where it went, and now where it's coming back to. Detroit is the largest city in America that has ever filed for bankruptcy. They filed in 2013. They are now in a phase of redevelopment. The interesting thing about Detroit is we know the collapse of the auto industry in America for multiple reasons. Detroit, though, I find, Detroit's one of those cities that is in what I call the Goldilocks zone. It has the right combination. It's got talent, it's got culture, it's got cost of living, and anybody that does anything with real estate or anything, location, location, location. Detroit is the largest American city on the US-Canadian border. The Detroit-Windsor Bridge Tunnel is one of the busiest, I think it's the second busiest international crossing in the United States, only after San Diego and Tijuana. Detroit has water connections. We have the lake, and we have the seaways that go all the way out. Detroit has a prime location. 75% of their R&D facilities, of automobile R&D facilities, are in Michigan. Within 100 miles of Detroit, you have some of the top 20 engineering schools in the country. Again, we see this again and again and again with these cities. They are anchored to the universities that are surrounding them. Low cost of living, pipeline of talent coming from these large public land-grant universities that have enormous resources. Minneapolis. Minneapolis is especially known for its startup ecosystem involving life sciences, healthcare, agriculture, and technology. It's very rich in talent. It is a hub spot for a lot of companies. Target is one of the biggest companies that's based in Minneapolis. It has one of the highest educated populations of the cities that we are talking about. A huge numbers of PhDs living in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul general area. It's the second largest economic center in the Midwest, behind Chicago. Why so many PhDs in Minneapolis? Probably multiple reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons is, of all the cities that we have listed on here and that we're going to talk about today, Minneapolis is probably the most liberal of all of them. Now, they're all fairly liberal cities, especially compared to their local environments surrounding them, but of all of them, Minneapolis would be the most liberal. And so let's look at the American Midwest just in general then. So we talked about some of the cities. So what are some of the other aspects of it? So we talked about there's low cost of living in the Midwest. Living in the Midwest is much cheaper than just about anywhere else in the United States, except for perhaps the American South. Okay? I did my graduate work in Seattle. Seattle is not cheap. And I'm not joking when you can literally make a six-figure salary in places like Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and you need roommates. The Midwest is totally different. And this really will take a change with remote work. Remote work is going to change everything, but it's going to especially have an impact on the American Midwest. I know there are definitely some people in the business community who think, no, remote work is an aberration. COVID is starting to dissipate. We are all going to start to return to our offices. I know Apple is having a big issue with this and everything. My view is remote work is here to stay. I don't think we will ever fully go back to pre-COVID days. Remote work is here to stay. And because of this, these coastal companies can now compete globally for talent rather than just restricting their hiring to the coast. So why work for Google and have to pay a fortune to live in San Francisco when I can work for Google and I can live in Iowa for a fraction of the cost? Again, we have a rich and deep talent pool to draw from. And this is, again, going back to the ties to the large land-grant public universities that we have in the United States. It is just a pipeline that we have. Very, very, very large universities. And then finally, the Midwest rise as a startup is built on fundamentals. Kirsten was talking about Silicon Valley and the culture of Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, there's an entrepreneurial culture, yes, but within Silicon Valley, there's even a subset, I think, of that culture. It's very masculine. It is very male-dominated. Very, very, very competitive, maybe even aggressive, okay? It is going to be a little bit different in the Midwest, okay? Fiscal prudence, capital allocation, discipline. Why are we different? Again, go back to what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the Homestead Acts, and we tried to get populations into the Midwest. The Midwest was sparsely populated. If it was populated by Native Americans. And the government said, well, let's get some European settlers in there. And their view was, let's build it up. Again, who went there? German immigrants, Swedish immigrants, Norwegian immigrants. 100 years ago, in 1922, most people working in the American Midwest, and I'm talking about males here in this case, unfortunately, were manufacturers, farmers, laborers, or miners, just 100 years ago. That culture of grit, of perseverance, is displayed throughout the American Midwest. Even when new immigrant populations have come into the Midwest, that overall culture we have of grit is still permeating the new arrivals who are coming in. This is why I say, in my view, that the American Midwest hasn't made a 180. I think it's made a complete 360. The American Midwest, I think, was very much romanticized before the collapse of industry. And a prime example would be, think about, if you know the painting, American Gothic. If you saw it, you'd be like, oh yes, I know that painting. It's the painting of a farmer and his wife, and they're standing there, and they look very dour, kind of like this. It was almost a romanticized way of living. If you lived in the American Midwest, you were the true American, amber ways of grain, and you were working on the farms, and you were building up the country, and everything like that. And then the collapse of the manufacturing came, and we had mistake on the lake. We had the Rust Belt. We had the flyover states. And now it's back again. It's a complete 360. It is not a 180. It is a 360. They went from great, the American Midwest, to the collapse of manufacturing, back to an entrepreneurial hub. The culture is very different from that of Silicon Valley, much more cautious. So let's talk about Ohio, okay, or Cincinnati in general. So Cincinnati, Ohio is, the main city in southern Ohio. It is along the Ohio River, as Toby was pointing out earlier. And so the city leaders came together and they decided, let's create a blueprint for jumpstarting our economy. And it would have fundraising options, accelerator programs, a central location in Union Hall, and that we're going to partner big companies for partnerships so we can benefit from their innovative efforts. And so this was developed alongside, we have a neighborhood that we have in Cincinnati called Over the Rhine, OTR. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. And then our startup system is known as, our ecosystem is known as Startup Cincy, and it's had a lot of success connecting startups and corporations. Major corporations in Cincinnati include P&G, Kroger, Fifth Third Bank, GE Aviation, Macy's, Givaudan, companies like this. And so, what we have here is basically a very general context of how Startup Cincy has been working over the last few years. And they're doing it in very prescribed and deliberate steps. So I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses here, so I'm going to have to move here so I can see. So we have Centrifuge, which is the bootstrap, basically for Startup Cincy. It curates an investment pool and an venture funding, and it works with a lot of these big companies that I mentioned. They then send them over to the Brandery, which is a seed stage accelerator, and it's going to leverage local expertise, branding, marketing, design, to create programs that are going to lead to the startup's success. And the city is trying to funnel a lot of these new startups into Over the Rhine, the neighborhood that we call OTR. I'm going to talk about Over the Rhine for a minute, the neighborhood OTR. I just say OTR, so that's what I'm talking about. You cannot talk about Cincinnati's startup success without talking about the neighborhood that we call OTR. OTR was the old German neighborhood in Cincinnati. Remember I said, Homestead Act, we got a lot of German populations in the Midwest. In Cincinnati, we started getting a lot of Germans in the 1830s. After the revolutions of 1848, they really started coming into Cincinnati. And we had, at that time, we had a canal going right in the middle of Cincinnati. And the Germans lived on this side of the canal. And so the locals were like, oh, where do I go to find the German neighborhood? They called the canal the Rhine. And so they said, the Germans live over there, over the Rhine. And the name stuck. And we have the name OTR even today. By the mid-19th century, the entire neighborhood was German, German schools, German restaurants, German churches. There is still a Catholic church in Cincinnati today, in OTR, that does Mass in German every Sunday. The population in that part of the city, they generally did not speak English. They spoke German for the most part. After World War I, the neighborhood started to decline. There was anti-German hysteria tied to World War I at that time. Many of the German population moved out. White Scotch-Irish from the Appalachian Mountains started to move in. Property values started to decline a little bit. In the 1940s and 50s, the U.S. embarked on a great infrastructure building program. This included highways. And so obviously they built highways through Cincinnati. Well, where did they build these highways through? Through the African-American neighborhoods. And so they knocked down all the African-American neighborhoods, and a lot of them, where do they have to go somewhere. Where did they go? They moved into OTR because it was very cheap at that time. So from the 1950s and 60s, you had the black population of Cincinnati moving into OTR. By the early 2000s, OTR was in a bad place. If you've ever seen the 2000 film Traffic with Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones, it's about drug trafficking between the United States and Mexico. About half that movie takes place in OTR. And it does not look good. It is not a good portrayal, but that's how OTR looked 22 years ago. In 2001, there were massive race riots in Cincinnati at that time, and they were centered in OTR. And the city said, we can no longer have this. We have got to do something about this issue here in OTR. And so what they did was a very deliberative program to turn the neighborhood around. They created a nonprofit, 3CDC, to revitalize OTR in a mixed income area. And the very first thing they did, this always makes me laugh, is that they eliminated the city planning office. because they said the city planning office has just issued report after report after report after report, and nothing has happened, literally for decades. So they got rid of the city planning office, and they basically use a mixture of public, private, and federal funds, and they did the same thing. They brought together large companies with startups, accelerators, seed funding, and then they would channel all of them into OTR. The one thing OTR had lots of: buildings, abandoned buildings. There are blocks and blocks and blocks of abandoned buildings in OTR. 3CDC bought up the buildings, renovated them, and then we funneled the startups into this area. There are no national chains in OTR. You will not find a Starbucks in OTR. Sorry, I'm not a fan of, I'm from Seattle, but I'm still not a fan of Starbucks. And so we have turned this into a very, very, very successful area. There is no doubt that OTR is the most successful, the biggest success story coming out of Cincinnati in the last 20 years. We've seen great early returns on development, and we have a really, really strong and promising future. Now, there are a couple of aspects here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. A little bit more, some of the details. Centrifuge, which is what we talked about, the entrepreneurial context of Cincinnati. Centrifuge brings together our startups, our venture networks, our stakeholders, our civic and government agencies, and then our corporate partners. So it's a continuous circle and conversation going on to support our thriving ecosystem. Some examples of successful startups here: Lausanne, Astronomer, Lisner. I'm not going to go into detail. These are all tech startups here. But I do want to talk about the last one down here, Halo. You'll see the symbol for Halo up here. We have the circle. We have the 3 little dots over on top of it. What's it look like? Any idea what this looks like? Does it look like a handprint or a footprint or like a ring maybe or something? An orbit and some planets? Ooh, that's a good one. I haven't thought about that one. An orbit and some planets. Okay. A bear paw. Okay. I like the orbit and planets, though, as an amateur astronomer. Thank you. Okay, that's pretty cool. A bear paw. The the United States has a very different university culture than anywhere, okay, else in the world. And we all know our universities have sports teams, and they all have mascots, and we're all big rah-rah fans on the weekends. The University of Cincinnati, our teams are the Bearcats. It's a real animal, I promise. And the Bearcat paw is basically our symbol. We have more claws with it to make it, more aggressive and everything. But that is essentially our symbol. Guess where the graduates who started Halo are from? University of Cincinnati. And I think this is an example. This is an example, again, of that American university culture making itself visible in the startup culture of America. Again, remember, our startup culture is tied to our large land-grant universities. Anybody who has ever spent a fall Saturday in America and you turn on the TV will immediately find football, football, and football, because they are all based on our large land-grant university culture. And so there's not just tech startups, we also have social businesses and entrepreneurship as well. I just want to talk about a couple of these. Brewhouse Dog Bones. So Cincinnati is a German city, which means, like many German cities, we had lots and lots of breweries that were in Cincinnati, and they were underground. And so we have turned these now into microbreweries. Cincinnati has a very strong microbrew scene. And so we have all these grains, and Brewhouse Dog Bones is taking young adults with cognitive disabilities and then making dog treats from the spent grains in local breweries. I love that. Be the Keeper is someone that Toby and I have actually worked with a few times. This is a UC grad. He was working at P&G and just got burned out. And so he did his own startup, and he essentially goes to companies, local governments, businesses, neighborhoods, and he helps them plant wild bee pollinating flowers, because bee colony collapse is a real problem worldwide. And so he is doing his little bit to help increase the bee population. And then finally, we have Flywheel, which is a social enterprise hub in Cincinnati. My colleague, Aaron Bradley, who unfortunately could not be here today, he does a lot of work with Flywheel. And it enables and empowers social entrepreneurs to scale their enterprises. Half of them are women, and 67% are people of color. Okay. And no, okay. Okay. And so now what we have, I think we want to stay within time. This is the innovation district that we have for Cincinnati. So along with creating startup Cincy and everything, the city and the University of Cincinnati have also been working to create the Cincinnati Innovation District. And so basically what this is very similar to along the lines of what Pittsburgh did. You had the city working with large companies, working with academia, and working with startups to create an entire district of Cincinnati where innovation can thrive. At UC, we now have the Innovation Hub, which is pretty much the anchor of this. And it does a lot of work with partners like GE, P&G, Fifth Third, et cetera. Now, there are some challenges and some critiques, I think, to the startup culture in the Midwest. It's not all great and everything like that. The two biggest challenges that I think are, one, infrastructure. Outside of Detroit is a city called Flint, Michigan, and Flint was the automobile hub, actually, for a long time. For the last 8 years, they have not had drinking water, and that's not isolated only to Flint. There are many smaller cities throughout the Midwest, Gary, Indiana, Joliet, Illinois, Cairo, Illinois, a lot of places like these in the Midwest that are having challenges with their infrastructure because, quite honestly, U.S. infrastructure has not really been overhauled in at least 50 to 60 years, and it is in desperate need of it, particularly in the Midwest. The second critique I have on the startup culture in the American Midwest is a new one. Political interference. In 2015 in Indiana, at that time, the governor of Indiana was Mike Pence, who was vice president under Donald Trump. In 2015, Mike Pence made some new laws that affected the LGBTQ community in Indiana. The big tech startups in Indiana immediately said, no, we can't bring people here if you're having these laws. It's not a good look for the state, for the economy, for our ecosystem. No. Mike Pence and the Indiana legislature backed off. That is not the case today. You are having all of these states that I've mentioned up here, with the exception of Illinois and Minnesota, all of them are red states. Michigan maybe is purple. We're starting to see in more and more red states political interference with local businesses. The prime example would be Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida. Ron DeSantis literally went to war, and that's not a startup, but Ron DeSantis literally went to war with Disney. Disney runs Florida, Central Florida. If red states are willing to go to war with these massive companies like Disney, they will not hesitate to go to war with small startups. In addition, startups are started generally these days in America. The younger population, the younger generation are very eager for startups. We see the numbers. About half of them are women. How many of these states are instituting anti-abortion policies right now? And if they are doing that, that will have a knock-on effect. Women are probably not going to be as likely to relocate, and probably lots of men also as well. So those are my biggest critiques of the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the Midwest right now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Neil, for
this journey in the Midwest and Cincinnati. So as your MC, Master of Ceremony, today for this conference, I'm keeping track of time. These have been very passionate and very informative presentations. Hopefully you find them very interesting, and there's a lot of new knowledge maybe that you're taking away from this. We still have one last segment to the conference we want to do. I think it's very interesting, but we do understand that some of you may have to leave in a few minutes, which is fine. But if you do not mind, I think we would continue a bit afterwards just to go through this last segment, which will be quite interesting. But if you need to leave, just do so quietly, and we'll continue. And for those who want to stay, and afterwards we can maybe exchange any questions that you may have. It will be a pleasure for us. The whole day is around this conference, so we're here with you afterwards if needed. So I would invite Kirsten just to come and present this last segment around Montreal and its entrepreneurial ecosystem.
All right, I'm back. So, challenge accepted. I'm going to try to do the Montreal ecosystem in 5 minutes, which is a bit hard to do, but I'm going to keep it to a couple of main ideas that I would like to discuss, because I know that after an hour and a half, concentration maybe goes a little bit down in the afternoon, so you might all need some coffee eventually. So let's dig in, and I'll promise I'll be as dynamic as I can. So, first thing, of course, we have a lot of statistics about Montreal, as in any city that is classified as characterized as a startup ecosystem or very strong entrepreneurial culture. There's always these rankings, and of course, about Montreal, there's a lot of positive things to say, which is that, well, there's a dispute if Montreal is actually the city that attracts the most financing in forms of VC. So we talked about it a little bit earlier, this form of investing in startups. There's a debate, is it Toronto, is it Montreal, depends who you ask. But anyways, so the Montreal promoters say, well, it's actually Montreal that attracts the most VC. The other thing is that there's a lot of movement in the Montreal ecosystem of supporting entrepreneurs. So I'm not necessarily talking about the culture of the entrepreneurs per se, but more about the organizations that actually have been created to support entrepreneurs. And before we actually even talked about the ecosystem, and we didn't have these terms that were officially recognized, we were not talking about terms such as incubators or accelerators, which are types of entrepreneurial support organizations, but we talked about des centres locaux de développement économique, so les CLD, which were actually the classic form of supporting entrepreneurship, but they were not recognized as such, like incubators and accelerators are today. So we have all these new actors in Montreal. Here in the statistics from last year, it says we have 30 and more support organizations, and I actually can tell you that this number is not correct, because together with master students, we did a list of all support organizations, and it's much higher than that. And it's actually impossible to track all of them down because it's moving so quickly. So you have this very dynamic landscape of incubators. So again, incubators and accelerators are support organizations which help companies, enterprises to build their first steps or to scale their business. And there's a lot of those actors actually in Montreal, as well as collaborative workspaces. So this culture of remote work is also very present in Montreal. Actually, Montreal has been voted as the second best city for remote workers because of all those spaces and the cost of living that is still reasonable. We'll hope it stays that way. Doesn't look like right now, but the idea is that there's this dynamics, and actually that a lot of new ideas emerge in those collaborative spaces, so that there's this movement and this flexibility, and maybe also I was talking about innovativeness earlier. That's maybe one of the aspects that lead to this innovativeness, because different sectors come together, different people come together, and different cultural origins come together and actually create these new ideas, which leads then to a diversification of sectors and new industries, such in music, arts, cultural, of course, high-tech is part of it, and also sectors such that are classical, like the microbrasserie, like the beer brewing industry that is very known in Quebec, that is actually also innovating now and reinventing their products currently. And that is also happening through this culture that exists in the Montreal city. So that's the good side of the story, okay? Continuing with the good side of the story, there's also, of course, a lot of actors, as I mentioned, which, of course, here is a Montreal ecosystem map of 2019, which is definitely outdated, but I just wanted to show you the number of co-working, support organizations, media, events, et cetera, that exist and that are constantly adding or disappearing and moving around. So now I'm going to come to, I need to be critical at some point, right? So I'm going to come to the drawbacks also of such ecosystem. And I'm going to come back to a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier about the state intervention and the coordination and those aspects. So a big discussion right now in the ecosystem is that actually, are we making it simpler for entrepreneurs to thrive in such ecosystem, or are we adding layers of complexity by adding actors in Montreal? So that's a real question, and it's a big debate, because what happened is that the state at some point said, well, here we go, let's build incubators, let's build accelerators, let's support entrepreneurs. So the language was shifted from this traditional economic development to ecosystem support and accelerators and incubators. But the question is, did we make things better by doing that? And for me, the answer is no. And there's already recognition of those aspects in the ecosystem. So there's currently an effort to actually sort out that jungle that was created of support organizations and that make it actually more transparent and easier for entrepreneurs, especially for those who are new to entrepreneurship or who are new to Quebec, who are new to Montreal, and who are trying to understand this whole ecosystem and this whole landscape. So basically, entrepreneurs were never better supported in terms of number of support organizations, but they were never worsely guided through the whole process because there's so many actors that were created. And that actually has cultural roots as well. I was mentioning earlier the intervention of the state. The state went ahead and said, well, let's fund those organizations and give them some money to actually support entrepreneurs, which is then, well, of course, a lot of those organizations were created and are now supporting entrepreneurs. However, there's maybe a lack of coordination when it comes to their mission and the different sectors they deserve. So now this is shifting a little bit. So now there's a tendency, the government says now, well, now if you want to receive funding, if you want to have a new project of supporting entrepreneurs, you need to collaborate. And how you need to collaborate, that's a different story, but we're trying to make the ecosystem more aligned, more inclusive also of different types of entrepreneurs and more understandable also for different kinds of entrepreneurs, such as, for example, social entrepreneurship, which is very different from the high-tech entrepreneurship that we mentioned earlier. So to really create sort of like a parcours, we say in French, like a trajectory for entrepreneurs with different kinds of businesses. So yeah, there's always, of course, a very good side to it, but also a downside to it. So again, numbers, I'm going to pass on this one. And I want to speak about one sector that you all know because everybody talks about it. And of course, in Montreal, there's a lot of talk about the AI industry and segment. And so just to say what is specific about the Montreal AI ecosystem, it kind of follows in a row of industries that the government was trying to foster. I was talking about Bombardier earlier and aerospace. So that was one priority of the government back in the 80s, etc. And now with all the talks about technology, there's big public initiatives also to strengthen the AI ecosystem. And here, well, we can see Montreal is number 3 in terms of aerospace after Seattle and Toulouse. But in terms of AI, well, there's currently a lot of debate. Are we number 2 after San Francisco? I wouldn't say so, but maybe number 5 or 6 in the world. So to really try and take this leadership. And you can see here the active state intervention actually to really push one sector. And since AI is seen as a very promising sector, well, of course, that's a focus right now. And the other particularity is that when you look at funding, There's, of course, the VC that I was mentioning earlier on your right, so the 1.4 billion, which is, of course, a considerable amount, not compared to the US, but still. But then you have on your left, you have the public funding, which you would not find in the States. So that, again, is the state who says, wait a second, I'm going to develop a strategy for actually publicly funding those companies and creating opportunities for them. However, that always also comes with a drawback. So that's a second drawback I wanted to mention, is that, of course, with money also comes rules. With money comes giving away some freedom of action. So maybe culturally speaking, if we speak about the individual, risk-taking, free entrepreneur in the USA, well, we might think a little bit about the more modest and going around rules and trying to get a combined strategy of public and venture capital funding in Quebec. So there's this comparison to the States and this jealousy sometimes to be a little bit more, to want it to be a little bit more independent when it comes to strategy and action, but at the same time, the appreciation still of the support that the government gives. And then you had a couple of companies that actually come mostly from the US, as you can see here in the list, a few Asians as well, that have a leadership in AI that came to Montreal. And this is the good side of the picture. Here you see the history of companies that opened up their branch of AI in the Montreal Innovation Hub. So we do have one as well, of course. And, but this also comes with drawbacks because a lot of those companies decided to eventually move away or to size down because of very active ruling when it comes to how to establish an AI company in Montreal, and also to the presence of a very strong French language politics in the company, which is known as Rule 101, so actually the active usage of French also for multinational companies. And of course, it has an advantage. It's a huge debate, so I don't want to go into pros or cons. However, it's definitely also a challenge for those multinationals in terms of human resources, in terms of international coordination. So that's definitely these particularities of the Quebec historic roots. We can see them also in an innovative sector such as AI. So that was my 5-minute Montreal. I hope 7.5, okay. So maybe just a quick overview before we really get into the last part of our today's presentation. So we do have a bit of sector strength that, of course, in Montreal, well, you see them on the screen, are AI, big data, and analytics, but also aerospace and social entrepreneurship. So you have also this strong culture in that is very grounded and engaged with the communities. And you have, of course, some ecosystem strength that foster this kind of entrepreneurship, such as, well, the universities as well. We have 4 of them in Montreal. And also, of course, the strong research presence and the public funding that helps actually research to get into private corporations. That is actually a characteristic also of Montreal. So do you want to complete, Neil, for the Cincinnati part?
Sure. And obviously Cincinnati has its subsector strengths as well: consumer goods and advanced manufacturing, aerospace. GE Aviation is based in Cincinnati. Logistics is very big. Location. 60% of the US population is within a 1-hour flight of Cincinnati. So logistics is huge. Amazon, DHL have big hubs in Cincinnati. UPS has its North American hub in Louisville, which is just an hour and a half south of Cincinnati. So again, is ecosystem strengths, again, is central location. Keep talking about it. The ties to land-grant public institutions, and in this case, the University of Cincinnati, which is a Tier 1 public research institution, of an educated workforce, more and more that's coming into the city, and again, that culture, that Midwestern culture of grit that just permeates not just Cincinnati, not just Ohio, but I think across the American Midwest. Even when you have new immigrant populations coming in, we have large populations in Cincinnati of Asians and Hispanics. Minneapolis has the largest Somali population in the United States, but that culture of grit that is ingrained permeates the new arrivals also as well.
Perfect. Yes, so we talked about cultural particularities. So here just to wrap up really quickly. So we talked about the ecosystem with the subculture, francophone and anglophone. That is, well, might be still present in Montreal. And then this integration of migrant entrepreneurs, the social-oriented projects, and the last part, the state-based initiatives that come, of course, with strengths, but also with drawbacks. And I'll hand over to Neil for the Cincinnati wrap-up and for the following.
Just like we talked about, the strong work ethic and the culture. Again, the location, Cincinnati was a gateway. Cincinnati was a gateway city for everywhere. If you're coming from the east or the south, it was a gateway to the west. If you were going up north, it was literally the gateway to the north. If you were coming down, it was a gateway to the south. That's the way Cincinnati was. It was the crossroads of America. And so they had a proud history. Cincinnati has if you go to Cincinnati and visit, you can see all the stuff. We had a really proud history in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Cincinnati was spoken of in the same sentences as New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Chicago was nothing in the 19th century, really, until after they rebuilt it after the fire. Cincinnati they want to reclaim this really proud history. And I think they see a path towards that through reinvigorating our startup culture that we have.
All right. So I'll hand up the challenge to the master of ceremony to really briefly wrap up with the last thing.
Thank you, Kirsten. So very briefly, we wanted to conclude today's conference just by talking about the links that the two universities have. So University of Québec à Montréal and University of Cincinnati. So over the past 20 years, we actually have the honor today of having one of the founding professors of this partnership, which is Jocelyn Desroches, who is here with us today. And so basically 20 years ago, a partnership emerged between the two universities around one course, around the theme of social entrepreneurship. And basically this course here, you see a few groups over the years that have participated in this class. But basically, this course was not like two groups working separately. It was from day one group based on two campuses, based in two cultures. And we had University of Cincinnati students come to Montreal in September. So it was in the autumn semester, right? So semester starts, we would work, 20 years ago, it was through technology. So prior to COVID and Zoom calls and everything, this class was happening over the technology. So for students, it was a great learning opportunity of how to work in this globalized world, right? And so basically, 2 weeks in the semester, Cincinnati students would come to Montreal, spend about a week here, discover a whole new culture for them most of the time, new language, new culture. For some of them, it was the first international experience they had, so coming to visit UQAM and Montreal, so great memories. And during that week, students would meet but form teams that they would work on during the whole semester. And these teams, they were truly intercultural teams and interdisciplinary teams. And they built an actual business plan around a social business that they would create. And so in September, teams were formed. During the semester, they would work week after week after week in a joint effort. So it was not like, doing their work and separately. It was really trying to work together with the cultural maybe challenges, with the distance, obviously, sometimes the language challenges, but they made it happen. And in November, we had UQAM students that would actually fly to Cincinnati. So here you see a few working in the airport. And again, for UQAM students, it was a great experience to go and discover this Midwestern culture, as Neil mentioned, these huge university campuses that we don't really have here, but going to the UC campus, having the football stadium on campus, it's a true city within itself. And for the UQAM students, it was very impressive to be there and live that kind of American university cultures that, we kind of see in the movies here, right? And so this whole partnership was really a cultural immersion, both for American students coming here and for Québécois students, going to Cincinnati and discovering this Midwestern culture and doing final presentations in November while in Cincinnati as a true unified, intercultural and interdisciplinary team. So this is how this collaboration started and emerged over the years. And obviously a lot of social events. So there's a lot of work, around these social businesses, but also discovering the foods, going to what's the name of Cincinnati was not mentioned, but has this Opera House has the second biggest Oktoberfest in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something pretty cool, going to Cincinnati, never experienced that. So having these cultural, so it was mentioned, huge German influence. And so for UQAM students going there, and so it's not just the United States, there's a lot more there going on, and describing these cultural contexts, right? And basically, here are a few very brief examples of business plans that emerged over the years. So it was around global issues. And so here you had a team who developed safe drinking water system for Haiti and for rural communities over there. So again, these are UQAM and UC students working together and finding, solutions for Haitian population. So very interesting. Here we have one in Ethiopia, again, around water, but here the teams mix, the water carriage systems with providing solar light, during the evening in these Ethiopian huts and everything. So again, they worked from September to November together, creating these very interesting projects and very complete business plans. Here we had a very interesting team a few years ago, providing feminine hygiene products in Senegal, and also working around education and awareness to fight the taboo of menstruation in this society. Again, UQAM, UC students working together, figuring it out how to make it happen on another dimension in the world. And finally, in DRC, here we had a team work on nutrition, building change impact purpose bars, and again, a lot of learnings here. So over 400 students, in the past 20 years, so on both campuses, working, in one group, trying to figure out common ground to develop, highly effective business plans. Over 50 of those business plans have been created over the years. Long-lasting friendships obviously have been created over that time, and certainly the openness to the world and global issues of many students of these two cultural contexts of these two universities coming, discussing, figuring out what they cared about, and building social businesses around that. And from this course, and this is what's interesting, from this initial course and collaboration, a lot of other professors have joined over the years and developed other courses outside of even management or entrepreneurship. Right, Neil?
Yes. So other programs that we've had come about in collaboration between our two institutions, all from this initial course, which at UC was INTB 3094, Social Entrepreneurship. Accounting for fashion majors, collaborative fashion programs between our universities. The University of Cincinnati has a very strong fashion program. French exchange programs that we have, obviously. Political science 4081, decision making in international organizations, which did a lot of work with Model UNs on the UC side. And next spring, we actually, I was thinking about this last night when we were in the panel discussion on cinema. Next spring, we have a course at UC, Film 2092 Canada Cinema Study Tour, which is actually going to come up here and look at Canadian cinema here in Montreal. Very cool.
Interesting. And so, where to go from here? So, and basically, we're finishing the conference with this, and afterwards, those who want to stay, have any questions, will be available and very open to share. So, a new social innovation course will be launched during the year. A new revised course from this social entrepreneurship course, trying to go a bit further, working with the social innovation district that was presented in Cincinnati. Many more connections with stakeholders in both entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we've presented a bit of what's going on in Cincinnati, a bit in Montreal. So, trying to collaborate much more with some of these stakeholders, much more involvement in the local communities in Montreal and Cincinnati out of this inter-university collaboration. So this is where we want to go from here. And I don't know if you want to add anything, both of you, Neil, Kristen, as closing words, and where do we go from here and being actively involved in this collaboration?
Just one or two things. Of course, there's always need to adapt to also current context, right? We had COVID, so that paused also the international traveling. So now we're looking really at innovating when it comes to this course and of connecting with the actors from the ecosystem on both sides. So yes, the Social Innovation Hub in Cincinnati, and also here with incubators and accelerators to actually really get those projects out there in the ecosystems and work together with partners that we're going to recruit. So, yeah.
I would just add, regarding the course that we had previously, we were discussing social entrepreneurship, and the new course we're working to develop right now, social innovation. We said that the joint teams that we had between our students, between the UC students and the UCOM students, we said those teams were intercultural, they were international, and in my opinion, the most important part, interdisciplinary. If I ask 10 business students, I have a problem. I ask 10 business students, hey, how can I solve this problem? I'm going to get 10 fairly similar answers. Now, that's not a knock on business students. If I ask 10 engineering students to solve a problem, same thing. 10 history majors, same thing. But when if I have 10 people and I have an engineering student, a pre-med, a business student, a musical theater major, a fashion design, as Toby will see, we get wildly different ideas bouncing around in class. That, I think, is the greatest aspect of this course that we've done, is the interdisciplinary aspect. The students, I think, are surprised by it because so many students are in silos. They get stuck in classes and they're with everyone else in their same major and they're bouncing the same similar ideas off each other. It's when they step outside of their comfort zone and they start taking those risks and they get their best learning.
Good. So, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Kirsten, to you for your attention. We really appreciate, we understand there was a lot of passion here, a lot of information. So thank you for staying with us. And now I would invite you to share any questions, any comments, any thoughts that you may have. And we'll continue with you. Again, if any people need to head out, please do so quietly, but we'll continue as long as we can and you want to stay with us. So any questions, comments, feedback based on everything we have shared? I know there's been a lot, right? Covering the Midwest, covering Cincinnati, Montreal, entrepreneurial ecosystems, but also the first segment, the cultural context of both countries. Yes.
I didn't. Oh, yeah. I don't know if I could accurately say maybe a third culture developed out of it or something like that, but definitely a collaborative. Let's put it this way. The average UC student is white, middle class, female. They probably do not have a lot of international travel experience. If they do, it was probably with their parents or their family, maybe to Europe or something like that. And I think when they come here, the great thing about working with UCOM and coming to Montreal is because it's such a francophone city and you have such a divergent population in Montreal. You guys, I know, I had a list of this at one point. You guys have had students from Tunisia, Cambodia, Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, Morocco, Italy, Belgium, Lebanon. I mean, there's so many and our students have never had that experience before. And if you think, you might have a team, you might have one American, one Canadian, and then someone who's Cambodian, and then we have had students from India, someone from India. They're all bringing different views. And it's tough, it's hard. We've had lots of issues where we had to sit students down and everything, but it's an important, valuable lesson because I don't care what industry you work in. You cannot do anything these days without practically international collaboration at some point.
and if I may add, and I'll invite you to think of any other questions you may have, but out of this collaboration, what happened at the end of every semester, and Jocelyn can attest to this, but we would have a feedback, one course kind of feedback debrief kind of session for the experience that students have lived, right? And one of the key learnings that most of these students have had based on this, it's not just UQAM and UC, but as Neil said, these teams, more or less 5 individuals per team, at least, 3 of these 5 students had very diverse cultural backgrounds, at least 60% of every team, right? So if you add that up, it really creates a lot of cultural understanding. And what happens through this type of collaboration is you really create global citizens at the end of the process. So it's not just a university student, doing a course to have 3 credits and kind of, it's really a course that has really impacted a lot of these individuals for the best, right? And just understanding that there's other ways of thinking, other ways of living, teamwork and communicating and just dealing with time. Just the concept of time, right? Just between the United States and here, there's differences. But then if you add other cultural kind of backgrounds, just dealing with time and expectations and all of that.
Communication.
Oh, and so that's what really has been generated through this type of collaboration. And that's why we invite, more of this type of collaboration. And we want to expand the UC and UQAM kind of effort and have it, evolve with other partners because, it's really exponential. It's not 1 + 1, right? It's really, it's really exponential. And that's how we've lived it over the years. So I don't know if, Jocelyn, you want to add anything, or if there's any other questions, I'll go around with the mic and we can just have this kind of...
Well, I guess you all realize in the room that indeed if you look at the professors now that are now taking over and following up on what was we created for the last 20 years, we've always had such a diverse background around we always had such a diverse backgrounds from the professors who were there. I mean, there were 2 of us who were a little bit older than the new incoming professors with different backgrounds as well. So that starts right there. But it seems to be this everyone that has gone through to this course are now very, very, very happy to have done it, and they will remember for the rest of their lives if you were to ask them which course they are more proud of to some extent, even though it started very difficult sometimes simply because of the different among them. Well, I think that they ended up having a very, very good experience, which will be useful for the rest of their lives as well, guys. Very important.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Do you have... let's go around, and then, perfect, I'll come back to you.
Okay, so Kirsten, I'm wondering if you can comment on, so Neil just talked about the fact that university, UQAM is so diverse, especially compared to UC. Do you see that same diversity when you go in, like you talked about the AI ecosystem and the people who are working in that? Do you see that also reflected? Is that translating over to these ecosystems? Like, who's doing these startups in Montreal? I'm curious because I'll just say that this is kind of an issue that we're very interested in and following closely because AI is so much on the rise here, but it's kind of like if you don't have diversity of opinion and thought, representation in AI, like where is this? Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yes, so thank you for that question. It's a great question, and it's, I think, also determining the future of the sector here and the leadership Montreal can have, because we saw, I'll go back to the Silicon Valley, we saw that there was a lot of migrants, actually, who determined the Silicon Valley, Indians and Chinese mostly, and then it diversified, of course. But here it's a little bit different, I would say. Of course, there's a lot of migrant entrepreneurship in general, and with colleagues in this room, we actually work on the topic of migrant entrepreneurs and their creativity and their innovations. So I do believe that they're very important to the sector. However, sometimes that diversification of profiles and of backgrounds, we talked about disciplines before, like fields, needs to be strengthened in my view. So, and that maybe comes back to this historical roots of how sectors are organized and are fostered by the state and all the dynamics that come with it. So I do believe that there is diversification, yes, in terms of people who work for those startups. I think there's a lot of recruitment internationally going on and a great effort to integrate also a diverse workforce. But in terms of who's leading those companies and who's building them from scratch, there's some work to be done in my view. And we do have some great incubators and accelerators in Montreal who actually help migrant entrepreneurs come in and be the leaders that we need, and maybe also integrating into the ecosystem. However, this is work in progress, and this is also recognized by governmental actors and also by colleagues of mine who also see that, well, there needs to be this flexibilization of structures that have too long existed in more of a hub-oriented structures, and that needs to be opened up a little bit, not to the extreme of the US. I disagree with, that we have to be like Silicon Valley. There's an own entrepreneurial culture here in Quebec that is very responsible and very authentic, and that can have the potential to integrate those diverse profiles, but it doesn't explore it fully yet. So for me, there's still some work to be done in order to maintain or even build that leadership position for AI. Yeah.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. So my question is about the difference between Cincinnati, si je prononce bien, and also Montreal. So from what you explained, I can see that the city there is involved in the building of the entrepreneurship ecosystem. In Montreal, I don't see that much. So we can see the government who is putting more money for startup through different programs, but I cannot see the involvement of the city. And where the city is involved, I believe they are trying to bring together the different components of the ecosystem, like the industry, like all these people, but I don't see that much in Montreal. So I don't know, how do you see it, Kirsten?
So your question is my point of view on the evolution of the city,
yeah,
or can you
no,
rephrase it in a...
Yeah, among the difference between the two ecosystems, in the US, we can see that the city is involved, has some leadership on building the ecosystem. But here, we don't see the leadership of the city in that. So how do you see that?
Okay, thank you. Bonjour Octave en passant. So, yes, great question. I do think, well, if we look at it historically, like I really like looking at the development since not only 5 years ago, but a little bit longer ago. I think Montreal has been doing a tremendous job on actually evolving because, Quebec used to be, well, Quebec is the capital of Quebec. Quebec used to be at some point the economic attraction point. And of course, if we go far back, then Montreal has done a great job. But I think also by doing that, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of the fact that we have this bilingual or multilingual city, the fact that we have this co-evoluting structures. And again, I'm going to come back to the coordination aspect, sometimes slows down Montreal in comparison to other international cities such as Toronto, and if you want to take a Canadian example. But I also think that's a good thing. And I will explain why. I think that sometimes it takes a bit of reflection and a bit of integration of diverse viewpoints in order to evolve, and maybe slower, but also in a strong way. I'm not saying that Montreal is evolving better than Cincinnati. That's not my point. But my point is that I do think that Montreal has a very authentic way to do things and to evolve over time, and has done a great job in maintaining, for example, the aerospace leadership. And we'll see what happens with the AI question and other industries such as video games and arts. So there's been this great initiatives that have put Montreal in the center of such an industries. At the same time, Montreal has, I find its very authentic way of doing things, and it should stay that way. For me, it should stay that way, even if it slows down and makes things a little bit more responsible. It should stay that way. But I think the challenge for Montreal is to keep and to maintain its authenticity as a city and not to get jealous or crushed by other cities that seem to evolve more quickly. Because for me, sometimes slow evolution is still an evolution, and sometimes in a very good direction as well. So it's not, maybe not a 360 degree, but it's, you know, it's a little bit left and right. Sometimes we take 2 steps back. That's okay, but there's work to be done. But for me, it's a good thing that we're not, you know, going from one viewpoint to the other too fast as well. So that's also for me part of the Québécois culture, to like have this consensus, to speak to people, to advance together and not to move in various directions at the same time.
Yes.
Just to add to that, there's a lot of things that Montreal actually is doing a lot of things. PME Montréal is a very good example that they are putting finance for a lot of projects where people can bring their ideas and to get funding for that. At the same time, they are providing money for PROMI, as an example, an organism that I've worked with this spring with immigrants, a team of a cohort of immigrants, 1 per month of 25 persons providing an ID for their projects, and sometimes they have very strong projects. PhDs and people like that from other countries are coming in Montreal, and they don't have a formal statue actually in the city, in the province. So they don't know where to go with their good ideas, and they're sometimes working with a US university instead of hospital in Montreal because nobody at CHUM wants to speak to them. So it's strange sometimes, but there's missing pieces, but there's a lot of groups that exist currently on the market.
And but I just want to add, while Cincinnati's revitalization of OTR can be considered successful, there are major challenges also as well. The population of OTR is 80% African American. When they decided to revitalize the neighborhood, they purposely said, okay, we're going to create a mixed income neighborhood because we want the local inhabitants to be able to stay here. We want to try to keep gentrification as little as possible. Good in theory, and they have had some success, but then you do other things. So the local population will say, well, okay, yes, we have mixed income, we have housing we can afford, but guess what? We can't afford any of the merchants here anymore. None of them. There are no grocery store. All the corner stores we had are gone. We have no place to shop, no place to buy food. They made them take out all the laundromats in OTR. And so the local population now says, listen, unless you have one of these completely revamped buildings that are $250,000 penthouses, we have nowhere to wash our clothes. I mean, these are basic, simple things. So yes, successful, but still a lot of work to do.
Yes. So we have another question, and I'll come back to you. Still have, no? Okay.
So I was interested to know, again, with the UQAM Cincinnati group, you said there was a lot of students from different disciplines, and that creates, you know, amazing ideas, very varied. I would like to know, from observation, what type of, who was, whether it was the discipline, the culture, I don't know, who was the profile that stand out as a leader more? Because there's always one person that stands out and becomes like the unclaimed leader of the group. And what is the specificity of that profile? Was there similarities in like different groups that you've noticed? Was there a specific way of, you know, approaching problems, issues? Who was like the key personality that was usually the leader that was created?
Man, every group is like every person, unique and their own individual. Do you want to?
Oh, definitely. That's a great question, and we've reflected on that quite a bit, and students have reflected on that because it always comes up, and two really big things, very interesting. So just academically speaking, okay, two very different trajectories. In the United States, students finish high school and go to university. In Quebec, students finish high school and go to what we call cégep, which is a transition period of more or less 2 years between high school and university. And that transition period is much closer to what you live at university than high school in terms of having, an unstructured kind of schedule, having courses here and there, having more teamwork and being more autonomous in how you work. And so what students realized, that's one of the things that stood out, is that, students at UQAM had that kind of skill set that they were able to develop through cégep and that transition period that in the United States, they did not have necessarily that skill set based on that. Second thing, there's also a generational disparity. So students here at UQAM more or less are a bit older on average than what you would find at University of Cincinnati and maybe in the university and collegiate kind of system in the States, where the age difference is a bit, it's higher here. And you have also a lot of people here who have left school for a number of years who would come back to school. So we've had teams with UQAM students, having more or less, 25, 28, 30 years old. And having work experience and having managed, people in the work field. And then you would have these university students in the States who, very well-intentioned, great ideas, but less experience and have not really managed people working on in the workforce and stuff like that. So those were two things that stood out. And so you would have great leaders emerging from the United States and the UC groups. But on average, maybe a bit more here, just based on the age difference sometimes and that work experience that students here would have maybe more than what we would find in the United States. So that would maybe be two explanatory reasons. But yeah, everyone, and then it's a challenge for older people to work with younger people having different mindsets, and how do we find common ground working on the same team, and so that's part of it. It's not just intercultural, interdisciplinary, but it's also sometimes intergenerational, right? Yep. And that's what's interesting with a collaboration with two different systems, because you have different types of students, and it creates, magic, but there's a lot of learning opportunities in that as well. But great question.
On the UC side, we recruit from different student populations. You recruit from UQAM in general, pretty much. I work with the honors program at UC, so our students must be undergrads. And so, it's not uncommon maybe for half our students to be 19 in the program. And as Toby said, if a lot of your students are 24 or 25, there's a massive difference between a 19-year-old and a 25-year-old. And so that is challenging at times. Sometimes surprisingly not, actually. And then you really get to see, like, oh, this 19-year-old kid is leading this group, and this group includes some older students. That's impressive also as well. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Definitely. So we'll take maybe one last question, if there are any. Just, time just flies by. But
time flies when we're having fun.
Yes.
Add on to that, is there an alumni network from these collaborations, and do they interact again after a few years, after they finish their project, or their continuous exchange?
It's, to be quite honest, listen, like I just said, all groups are different. There are some groups that were tighter than others. Okay, and so in some groups over the years, they have maintained that bond. They have maintained that closeness. I know some of our students have come up here before, like a couple years later. Oh yeah, I gotta see them on Facebook. Oh, I'm gonna meet with so-and-so. I met them 2 years ago, blah, blah, blah. That does happen. We do reach out to our alums for stuff like this. On the UC side, we have a Google alumni network with this class, because a lot of our students, at least about 5 or 6 of them in the last couple of years, have gone on to work for Google out in California, and Tejas is actually with Google Ontario, I think, actually right now, last time we talked to him. So we reach out to them, the ones that are local, the ones that have gone outside of Ohio. When we were doing this virtually the last 2 years, I would set up virtual, like I call them dinner with strangers. And I would invite some of our alums and I would invite the students to come in and we would just eat and we would just talk about entrepreneurship and things like that to talk with our alums. They would talk about what our alums did, what their projects were. They would bounce ideas off each other sometimes. Yeah, pretty cool. So I would like to do more of that. It's easier said than done. I got tasked with building an alumni network with the honors program last year, and I quickly realized how challenging it is to reach out to people who are maybe no longer connected on a daily basis. But yeah, it's something we would love to do more. I think when we relaunch this new class, I think maybe one of the things we might want to keep in mind is how do we maintain that alumni presence going forward? It's probably something we didn't consider in 1999 when we first put this class together.
Like mentoring function of the alumni.
We've done some of that, yes.
We've tried, so informal small networks are still in existence of these groups and these classes, but there's not really a formal structure. We've tried a bit, but it is challenging. But I think it is also one of the efforts we want to do as we move forward. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This was a great conversation, great exchange, great questions. Officially, we'll be done. But if anyone wants to stay a bit and chit-chat, I know I'll stay, maybe kneel a bit. And then as we kind of move out of the room. But thank you very much for participating, and hopefully you enjoyed this as much as we did. All right. Thanks.
Thank you for the privilege of your time.
Yes.